Welcome to our lecture series, to our last lecture series in the year 2022. I want to remind you that still the occupation in Hörsaal 3 is ongoing. So if you are interested, you can join there. Or I'm pretty sure that in the universities out there are some occupations are ongoing as well. Please join and ask if you can support in any way. And today we have to do a sharp cut at 5:15, so we have to end because Professor Andreas Oberbrantacher has to join another meeting at 5:30. Today we take up a very current topic in our lecture series, climate protection. We are going to talk about civil disobedience. I would like to welcome Professor Andreas Oberbrantacher, who has been an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy since 2015. In addition to philosophy, Professor Oberbrantacher also studied history, European ethnology, and comparative literature at the University of Innsbruck and Nottingham. Professor Oberbrantacher will soon be launching a book on the topic of fleeing and migration. The title is Illegale, ein Grenzphänomen zwischen Flucht und Migration, which can certainly already pre-ordered at your trusted bookseller. I think it's just held in German. Now I have the pleasure to welcome Professor Andreas Oberbrantacher, and I'm looking forward to his lecture, Sabotaging Climate Change, Civil Disobedience and the Anthropocene.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Ingo. It always feels a little bit like having an outdated biography, because in fact I didn't really take care of the data found on my homepage, and for that reason it feels like I'm a few years younger than I actually am, because a lot of the things that you mentioned have in fact already changed, at least to a certain extent. So thanks very much once again for the introduction, and please excuse this disturbance at the very beginning of my presentation, and also that I will have to rush in a little bit less already than 1 hour. At the time when I conceived this contribution to the lecture series, some of the cases that were debated in the media and that contributed to a major controversy were not yet known. So I didn't have immediately that intention of focusing on sabotage because of the media attention that certain forms of direct actions received through forms of scandalization, but rather because I had an interest in discussing some of the arguments that so far did perhaps not receive that much scholarly attention in the context of climate change action. And this is the reason why I thought also that it might be interesting for a variety of reasons to make a connection between climate change, this lecture on climate protection, and a longer and also quite rich, even though also quite ambivalent history of sabotage as a form of direct action. As you might have noticed, I also slightly changed the subtitle of my paper. I will be speaking, since this is the more appropriate term also in distinction to civil disobedience, about direct action and its relationship to the Anthropocene. What you see here in the background is that symbol, which historically was used, if I'm not mistaken, already in the 19th century, but latest at the beginning of the 20th century to symbolize the history of sabotage as a particular form of direct action related to movements of workers' rights and syndicalism, a symbol that has been also translated to a certain extent to other forms of direct action in the field of ecological strikes and direct action. What I would like to do as part of my contribution to this lecture series is to briefly reflect on the history, or you could also call it a counter history of sabotage as a particular history of political action that came also with its own theory that can be, in etymologically terms, traced back to the word sabots, which stands for wooden clogs, simple shoes that, according to a certain narrative for which there is no specific evidence, were used to sabotage certain textile machines in and as part of the Industrial Revolution. So the word sabotage comes from the sabots, which is also a word related to the zapatas and to the zapatistas, basic peasant shoes that were also conceived and seen as means that were directed against a form of mechanization and industrialization, especially in the 19th century. So I would like to begin my paper by recalling some parts of this counter history, by illustrating also through a number of images how rich and how image the history of sabotage is, how it was eventually also a part of mainly the international workers movement, but how it was also developed further in a number of other contexts, not least the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front. In the second part, I will address in more conceptual terms distinctions between the tradition of civil disobedience and that of direct action. And I will argue that in conceptual terms, the discussion of civil disobedience gathered more scholarly and especially also more philosophical attention, whereas direct action was very often neglected with the argument that direct action is infringing on property rights, and for that reason it is more difficult to find a justification for direct action. And in the final part, I would like to bring these different parts of my paper together in terms of brief reflection on current debates and current forms of climate change action. So let's begin with a brief counter history of sabotage by assembling a number of images and a number of historical situations that can help to illustrate that this is not a recent phenomenon, but that it can be indeed traced back to a much longer and quite complex history. Historians that discuss sabotage as a particular form of action, of political action, of that what conceptually was then later on called direct action, usually refer to the movement of the Luddites, a movement that was also characterized as anti-machinist movement of the beginning 19th century, where in especially the area of Nottingham, it happened repeatedly that workers assembled, entered into into one of the businesses and started to destroy the textile machines. These textile machines were, for some of the protesters, a particular issue, because due to this industrialization, a lot of people did in fact also lose their job or ended up also in much more precarious working conditions. Historians have pointed out that it was not necessarily the case. Some of the more mainstream accounts suggest that these Luddites were an anti-technological movement that rejected technology as such, but rather that it was a very radical form of self-organized workers that tried to confront the early form of industrial capitalism with the misery that this capitalism had created. It is still an open question if the term Luddites can be traced back to any particular person. Most scholars assume that there was no such person called Lud, from which this name derived, but that it was more like a popular name that this movement used in order to collectivize itself and in order to give itself a name. Even though the Luddites can be used as an example of how a movement of sabotage, of particular property destruction started to form in the context of early form of industrial capitalism, it is certainly possible to argue that forms of sabotage are basically known throughout the history of political resistance. It can indeed be also argued that sabotage is not just a form of direct action directed against a machine, as in the context of industrial capitalism, but as some other scholars are pointing out, in the context of anti-enslavement rebellions and radical slave insurgencies, since slaves themselves in the 18th and 19th century were conceived to be properties that belong to masters. A number of these forms of radical protests were not just directed against the symbols and the tools of enslaving people, like chains, amongst others, but in fact, there is also a history of how enslaved people have committed again and again suicide in order to withdraw themselves through their bodies, through their lives, from the conditions of enslavement. And in fact, from the perspective of the plantation owners, the perspective of the masters, this was also considered to be a sort of sabotage, because since the enslaved people were framed and conceived to be property belonging to slaveholders, any kind of damage inflicted that people inflicted on themselves was considered and conceived also as a property damage, and in that sense also as a form of self-sabotage. So what I'm trying to suggest here, first of all, is that there is a very long and a very rich and also very ambivalent history of sabotage that can be probably found throughout the history of forms of political resistance against forms of economic despotism, of economic commodification. The Certainly better known parts of this history are also related to the history of warfare in the context of the First World War already, but also in the context of the Second World War, where we find a number of resistance fighters and resistance groups that operated undercover, either as partisans or also in covert operations in order to damage the war industry, mainly also the Nazi regime. But also the United States had particular sabotage laws that were meant to target especially those secret agents that they assumed to be also sabotaging their own war economy. From this period of time, we do also know that different ministries did also produce and publish publications that were meant to support the different types of saboteurs that were carrying out covert operations in the context of anti-Nazi actions, like the War Department's technical manual of how to create sabotage bombs that could be deployed in the Nazi military industry, how they should be hidden and how they should be then eventually deployed. The next part of this history, which brings us already closer to our topic, is related to forms of direct action that eventually found their way into forms of militant veganist movements and animal liberation movements. In fact, the Animal Liberation Front is a movement that defined itself as militant from the very beginning, since it argued very much also in a tradition of the anti-plantation and anti-slavery movement, that there is a continuation of how once humans were kept and how animals are still being kept nowadays, and that it's also a moral obligation to not simply protest against these forms of cruelty and of oppression and exploitation in the form of civil disobedience, so just peacefully, but there is even the moral obligation. Members of the ILF would usually argue to engage in more militant forms of direct action by using also sabotage as a justified means in order to disrupt the fabrication of death in the agricultural system. Related to that, we do also find that sabotage took the form of sabotaging fox hunting seasons, or in general hunting seasons. The anti-fox hunting seasons were very popular and still are quite popular in the context of the UK, where groups of activists did interrupt and disrupt the rather aristocrat sport of going on a fox hunt together. So forms of sabotage have already been part of the more radical parts of the animal rights movement, of the animal liberation movement, of environmentalist groups. And the argument is that when compared to other, let's say, forms of protest, the forms of protest that were organized as a sabotage were considered to be mainly active forms of resisting aspects of injustice or entire systems that were considered to be unjust to the point of trying to completely disrupt these systems. As Gavin Müller writes in a book that was published only recently in and with Verso Press, entitled Breaking Things at Work, rather the first step of organizing disparate grievances into collective politics requires recognizing and recovering our own radical self-activity along with that of others, even and perhaps especially when it involves breaking things at work. So in the reading of Müller, sabotage stands in the tradition of collectivizing a particular form of political action, of liberating people also from the feeling that there is nothing they can do about it because the system is just so entirely unjust and at the same time so overwhelming that there is nothing else than despair. So Gavin Miller argues that sabotage gave people the feeling in the 18th, in the 19th century, and also in the 20th century that nonetheless people can do something about it, that there is still some kind of action that can be taken, even though this may eventually also mean to break the things that reflect this form of oppression. So very much prior to the forms of direct action that we find nowadays, already some decades ago, there were forms of sabotage involving, in some cases, also arson, committed, in this case, by the Earth Liberation Front. At one point, if I'm not mistaken, the United States government also claimed that the Earth Liberation Front is the perhaps most dangerous terrorist organization known to be operating in the United States. The total amount of destruction that it caused for different acts of sabotage amounted to several hundreds of millions of US dollar. Some of the targets were, for example, also the skiing industry, especially when the skiing industry infringed on popular wildlife sanctuaries. So they committed arsons, they destroyed some of the resorts, and they burned down also part of the tourism infrastructure in order to create a situation where it was simply not profitable anymore to operate these destinations. So what I did in this very first part of my paper was to collect a number of different moments that do together suggest that there is some kind of a counter history of political action. Political action that cannot be simply subsumed into forms of peaceful resistance as advocated also by civil disobedience, but that may also take the form of more direct action. Direct action that does not necessarily just result in forms of strike, of interrupting labor routines, but that can also take the form of directly targeting certain forms of inanimate infrastructure, be it machines or be it also cages, or be it also ski lifts. In conceptual terms, there is there are a number of major distinctions between the concept of civil disobedience and forms of direct action. And as I have also suggested at the very beginning of my paper, there's a certain tendency to emphasize especially the importance of civil disobedience as a legitimate form of protest, while forms of direct action are usually considered to be rather illegitimate, because from a liberal perspective especially, they do also question the property laws, since they are indeed very often also directed against private property held by either individuals or companies. A number of liberal scholars would say that this means already to cross the border between legitimate and illegitimate action. So when compared to direct action, civil disobedience attracted much more scholarly attention. It is usually also being something that is advocated, is something that is being justified, and that is something that in that sense also has been turned into a proper scholarly concept. Compared to that, direct action is very often also delegitimized. It is being considered to be unlawful, and it receives certainly less scholarly attention. But before going into this part of the discussion, let's perhaps consider two standard cases of emphasizing the importance of civil disobedience. The probably best known early thinker who has coined the phrase civil disobedience is Henry David Thoreau, who repeatedly emphasized the importance to resist civil government if the civil government itself is engaging in unjust behavior, be it civil government supporting slavery or wars. Henry David Thoreau protested against the slavery, protested against the American government going to war against Mexico, and he emphasized that in all those cases where we come across some blatant forms of injustice, it is actually justified to show our civil disobedience by not respecting certain parts of the legal system, by disrespecting symbolically certain laws, be it, for example, taxation law. And he writes in his essay, Resistance to Civil Government, Civil Disobedience, that it is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty at least to wash his hands of it, and if he gives it no thought longer, not to give it practically his support. If I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must first see, at least, that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders. I must get off him first, that he may pursue his complaints too. So Thoreau argues that even though there is no general obligation that we have to devote ourselves entirely to any kind of injustice, that it is not our moral duty to live our lives so that no injustice is committed, we nonetheless have to make sure that our way of living should be one that does not further and create injustice for others. So as long as my tax money is being used to support the war machinery, as long as my tax money is being used to uphold the slave system, it is also my moral obligation to protest against this, but peacefully and by disrupting and by disrespecting symbolically certain parts of the law. So this concept of civil disobedience did indeed become part of quite rich debate in political philosophy and theory on the relevance of civil disobedience, especially in the context of more liberal thinking. One of the best known figures in the context of more contemporary liberalism is John Rawls, with his book of Theory of Justice. He too argued that civil disobedience makes sense. Civil disobedience can be justified, but under some very specific conditions. He defines in a treatise on civil disobedience as a public, non-violent, consensuous yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. By acting in this way, one addresses the sense of justice of the majority of the community and declares that in one's considered opinion, the principles of social cooperation among free and equal men are not being respected. So one of the main arguments of John Rawls is that in one way or another, civil disobedience needs to be directed against a government. It needs to be directed against the authority of a state. It needs to be non-violent, so it should not be violent. It should not be directed against private property. It should not be directed against property at all, but rather it should focus on those parts of the legal system, the rule of law, which are considered to be inconsistent, contradictory, or in this sense also of violating the dignity of our human rights by engaging in forms of disrespect. This means that from a liberal perspective, a specific boundary was always drawn, the boundary being that forms of action can only be justified as long as they are directed against the government and as long as they're not directed against, let's say, private business, because private business should operate under the rule issued by the government. And for that reason, the only legitimate target here is the government itself. And another part of this boundary was that action should not be directed against people, first of all, but also not against property, because the very basis of any rule of law, liberals usually would argue, is the right to own property. And for that reason, the right to own property should not be contested by forms of political action. And eventually, also this form of civil disobedience should be civil in the sense of non-violent, argues John Rawls. But apart from this more mainstream debates and efforts to justify civil disobedience, we do indeed find that sabotage was not just a form of political action, of direct action, but that it also received some kind of scholarly attention, but that this scholarly attention did never have the same, let's say, scholarly status as the more liberal argument received. Already in the late 19th and early 20th century, we come across some texts that refer to sabotage and that try to reflect on sabotage, not just as a strategy, but also as a form and as a concept of political action. The best known case is that of Émile Pouget and his treatise on sabotage, where he argues that for the worker sabotage, which is aimed only at the means of exploitation against the machines and the tools, that is against inert, painless, and lifeless things, the bourgeoisie has nothing but curses and maledictions. On the other hand, the detractors and slanderers of the working class were never scandalized and never show any anger against another sort of sabotage, truly criminal, monstrous and abominable, which is the very life essence of modern society, the sabotage of the capitalists, which reaps human victims and deprives man of their health by sticking like a leech at the very sources of life. So Émile Pouget's main argument is that yes, the bourgeois class is scandalizing if we workers are trying to target machines, if we are trying to interrupt forms of industrialized violence by trying to create new working conditions for ourselves. And this bourgeois class is then soon claiming that this is pure violence, it is utter destruction. But at the same time, Émile Pouget argues they completely forget that what we workers consider to be a much major force of sabotage is the sabotage that capitalism itself has created by turning us into form of proletarians that have to live under miserable conditions. So Émile Pouget turns the argument around and says it's not us who are really violent. Those that are really inflicting violence are those who are also controlling and owning the means of production. So this is also part of this kind of counter history, texts on sabotage, which never gained that prominence, like the text by Henry David Thoreau and the later reflection by John Rawls, but that is nonetheless also part also of a counter history of alternative concepts of how to organize and how to understand protest. In the context of more recent cases of direct action that relates also to action taken against the G7 meetings and other meetings of a neoliberal globalization. Anne Hansen, one of the activists, recalls an interview and talking to another activist, where this activist says that the essence of direct action is a far more subversive idea than that of civil disobedience, because it's not meant to reform or influence state power, but is meant to undermine it, and not just state power, but very likely also the way private businesses are organized, by showing it to be unnecessary and harmful. When people themselves resort to violence to protect the community from racist attacks or to protect their environment, and here we are already back in the core part of this lecture series, from ecological destruction, they are taking direct action. So the counter argument from the perspective of those who favor and support direct action is to say that it's not so much us who are actually doing or engaging in violent behavior, but this is a form of self-protection, a form of protection that takes, first of all, into consideration the much larger, the much more comprehensive form of violence, of destruction that is caused by certain forms of behavior that is part of a logic of commodification, of consumerism, and so forth. That what can be also referred to as an imperial lifestyle. So I come now to the final and concluding part of my paper. So what are the current forms and what are the current debates related to climate change action as a form of integrating modes or aspects of sabotage into direct action? I would say that there is a plurality of means that have been used and that became noticeable over the past decades in the context of ecological movements, environmentalist movements that show also that the boundary between civil disobedience and direct action is not always very easy to determine, that what may start as an act of civil disobedience can also become a form of direct action. To start locally, one can also think of the occupation of the Hainburg, where also parts of this occupation took the form of a more direct action in terms of squatting, sitting in, of trying to stop vehicles, and in that sense of interrupting also infrastructure. It is not just something that we find now in the more let's say global north and wide context of the environmentalist movement, since scholars that are advocating direct action are also pointing out that it is also not accidentally the case that civil disobedience is very often also promoted by or let's say promoted in the context of a predominantly white world, whereas the accusation that this is actually violent, that this is a violent form of protest, is usually used as an argument to legitimize those forms of protests and of action that we find also in the global south or elsewhere. So when it comes to the more radical forms of environmental movements and the link to direct action, this is not just happening in the global north, but very often also in that what is referred to as the global south. One could, for example, mention here the repeated attacks against Shell in the Niger Delta, where also these attacks can be considered to be forms of sabotage. A more prominent case of interruptions of disturbing the infrastructure, of trying to block the machinery, is the Ende Gelände movement, which did also advocate forms and the modes of direct action, and argued that civil disobedience is not enough to stop pollution and climate change. We need to take action so that we are really able to stop this from happening and from spreading further. In similar terms, also here, let us also recall the Standing Rock protests as other forms of stopping the building and using of pipelines, as also forms of sabotage that were directed against the fossil industry. In this case too, this is an example of a more colored version of protest, one that is not predominantly a white version of how to engage in civil disobedience. And I'm mentioning these different elements found in different parts of the world, so as also to point out that what we have witnessed more recently in this year is not just the proverbial tip of an iceberg, but it's just one of the many examples that can be given that acts of sabotage, of direct action, were already part of the environmentalist movement, of the more radical approach to engage in ecological action. And in that sense, there is nothing new and nothing that needs to be particularly scandalized when it comes to blockades organized by the last generation, or more notoriously the Just Stop Oil, as it gained recently attention. So how is this being discussed and how is this being addressed in more recent forms of scholarship? The certainly best known book that received a lot of attention in the last 1 year is a book by Andreas Malm, who stands in the tradition of an ecological Marxist movement, and who published the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline, where he too argues that we need to think again about the history of protest, by thinking also if violence cannot be justified, not violence against people, but violence against forms of production that do indeed further and increase violence against the planet, against other people. Andreas Malm poses the following set of questions at the beginning of his book. where he says that what can be questioned, however, is something else. Will absolute nonviolence be the only way, forever the sole admissible tactic in the struggle to abolish fossil fuels? Can we be sure that it will suffice against this enemy? Must we tie ourselves to its mast to reach a safer place? What do we do then? Do we say that we have done what we could, tried the means at our disposal and failed? Do we conclude that the only thing is learning to die, a position already propounded by some, and slide down the slide of the crater into 3, 4, 8 degrees of warming? Or is there another phase beyond peaceful process? So Andreas Malm is arguing that, or is trying to counter the standard arguments that only peaceful protests make sense by showing that indeed the rich history of direct action shows us that no, we do find that in many cases also those forms of protest, which are usually framed as civil disobedience and as peaceful protest, did involve also acts of violence, and that violence indeed, if it is directed against forms of injustice, can also be a quite powerful means. And he also tries to argue that very often the argument against violence is also an argument against the resistance of colored, of black minorities, and that it stands also in that sense very much in line with the defense of a predominantly white world. So he argues that what we often do also have is some kind of almost sanitized history. Strategic pacifism, he writes, is sanitized history bereft of realistic appraisals of what has happened and what hasn't, what has worked and what has gone wrong. It is a guide of scant use for a movement with mighty obstacles, the insistence on sweeping militancy under the rug of civility, now dominant not only in the climate movement, but in most Anglo-American thinking and theorizing about social movements, is itself a symptom of one of the deepest gaps between the present and all that happened, from the Haitian Revolution to the poll tax riots, the demise of revolutionary politics. So I would like to stop here, because this is also where a current discussion is taking place. Perhaps you have already heard that only recently Bruno Latour and Nikolai Schulz published a small memo together. Some would say it's more like a manifesto, where they are also arguing that it might make sense to think of the current situation as an emergence of a new class. So after the classical class started to began to disappear, not least also the class of proletarians, perhaps also these more radical fractions of the ecological movement can perhaps be understood as a new avant-garde, as the formation of a new sense of belonging to an ecological class. I end with the following reference once again to Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Few processes produce as much despair as global heating. Imagine that someday the reservoirs of that emotion built up around the world, in the global south in particular, find their outlets. There has been a time for a Gandhian climate movement. Perhaps there might come a time for a Franz Fanonian one, so a more radical one that does not preclude the use of some forms of violence, and the breaking offenses may one day be seen as a very minor misdemeanor indeed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andreas Oberbrantacher, for the overview of civil disobedience and direct action. Thank you also for the insights. I know there is almost no time left for the discussion, sadly, but the last 2 minutes I wanna try to give you a question, an easy question, but I think without an easy answer. Do you know about is there existing a statistic to violent and non-violent civil disobedience or also direct action, and corresponding to the success of these movements? So the question is it better to have a civil disobedience without violence? Is there more successful than violent civil disobedience, or is there no existing statistic about that topic?
I don't know if any statistic would resolve this issue, because this statistic would already need to be able to systematically distinguish between that what we consider to be violent and that what we consider to not be violent. So the very definition what is violent and what is not violent is very much a matter of controversy. So I'm not just saying this because it is also a philosophical question, but because one of the main arguments that scholars and advocates of direct action have presented is that compared to what we are doing in terms of interruptions, in terms of blockades, in terms of also targeting that what is otherwise protected by property laws, it's a minimal form of violence, like saying if we are freeing animals from the cages and entering, and yes, I mean obviously from those who own these animals or believe to own these animals, it's a loss in revenue, but from our point of view, to focus on that form of property destruction means also to not realize how much violence is actually being done to the animals by a particular form of agricultural system. So the very question, what is here violence and what is not violence, is at stake. It is part of the controversy. But I think that Andreas Malm presents here a very valuable argument by also trying to show in some historical detail that we are often mistaken if we think that violent forms of direct protest did not succeed or were not be able to make a difference. He rather argues that our understanding of, let's say, the prominent cases of civil disobedience and so on are often trying to marginalize the violence that was indeed part of this protest. And he also argues that conceptually, to try to legitimize also some form of more violent form of protest directed against property, is very often corresponding with the interest of saving, let's say, a wide property-oriented world against the demand of, let's say, an unruly and disinherited and disenfranchised colored or black population. So he also points out that the argument that this is violent, that we shouldn't do this because this delegitimizes the entire movement, is often an argument used by the ruling class, supported by a certain tradition of philosophical thinking against protesters.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for the lecture and your input. I enjoyed it pretty much. I don't want to rob your time as needed. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening. I hope we hear us again.
Yeah, thank you so much. So again, perhaps a concluding thought, it's not so much about giving a final answer of what is right and what is wrong in the context of protest, but rather to start a discussion. That's also perhaps what I tried to do here. So thanks so much for the invitation. I'm sorry that I have to leave already here without having a proper discussion, but I think that in the context of the occupation and of other forms of protest, we will have the discussion anyway. Thank you again, and all the best to you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you here in the audience, and thank you online. That was the last lecture this year. The next lectures will be held in January in the beginning of January. Have a nice Christmas and a happy New Year. I hope we see us again.